it's only been within the last blink of an eye, historically speaking, that we've focused on this greed, this idea that we have to accumulate more and more and more. And in order for me to have a bigger piece of the pie, you've got to have a smaller piece of the pie. That's a pretty recent concept.
Yeah, and now, and the thing is, John, too, is that, well, one of the things we gets back to banking, I researched this back in Mesopotamia, like 4,000 years ago, that the maximum they could charge on a loan for interest on debt was like maybe like, I think it was like maybe 10% in silver, maybe or 30% in barley, that was the maximum you could charge. But what's the maximum you can charge on a loan today in America?
Is there a maximum?
There is no maximum.
Right.
My money.
Money.
I get money from you.
Money in the bank.
Young money.
Money, 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 money. It's a rich man's world.
It's great to get reacquainted with you and discussing your new book, Touching the Jaguar. And let me see the shirt, by the way.
Jaguar on my lap, baby jaguar.
Okay.
I'm surrounded by jaguars.
All right, now put the camera down. But anyway, but first, you're a New Hampshire guy. But first, just tell our viewers about where you grew up and just a sketch about your background, John. I know all about you, but if you could give people a Cliff Notes sketch about you.
Well, so I was the son of a teacher at Tilton boarding school in Tilton, New Hampshire. And it was an interesting youth that I had on that campus because I went to public schools through 8th grade, and then I went to the prep school where my dad taught. But my dad didn't make any money essentially. The school gave us a small house on campus. I ate with 200 boys from the time I was 4 years old in the big dining room. So I wasn't wanting for any of the essentials of life. But we to get an ice cream cone was like a major event in the summer, and yet I'm surrounded by all these very, very wealthy young men. And when I went to school there, years of high school, one of the most memorable experiences I have is Christmas vacation. When I spent the whole Christmas vacation shooting baskets by myself in the school gymnasium or hitting a tennis ball off the wall. I was a tennis player in the spring coming up. And my friends would all come back with these amazing stories about the time they'd spent in Paris or London or Buenos Aires or Park Avenue, New York, and the orgies that they had been to and all the wild women, which probably a lot of it was exaggerated. But to me, it was like, man, I want that. I don't want any of that. And so, when I became what we call an economic hitman, I was chief economist at a major consulting firm out of Boston. I was suddenly getting all these things that I thought were what I'd always wanted all my life. And it was a real hook. It was one of the things that drew me into that crazy world and kept me there for 10 years.
It was kind of almost, it's very almost sexy. I mean, you grew up in Tilton, but I was a townie. I grew up in Andover, Mass, and right on the campus of Phillips at Andover. And there was that economic divide, which, there was really kind of, as a Plutarch said, there's a divide between the rich and the poor, but it's always been that way. It always will be, but now it's just seemed to be even greater. Would you agree?
Totally. That was very obvious to me. So through 8th grade, I went to school with these kids who, grew up in a town. Tilton was very depressed. The mills had all basically closed down. The farms weren't working anymore because the big Midwest industrial farms had taken over. So the kids I went to school with, a lot of them were extremely poor. And then, but I was living up on the hill at the prep school. And there was a tremendous amount of resentment and conflict between the two. So much so that when I finally ended up going to the prep school and living on campus, I always lived on campus, but now I'm living on campus, going to the school for 4 years, I basically lost my friends in town. And a lot of it was my own doing. I just didn't, I was so divided. It was a world divided. It's interesting that you bring that up, Barry, because for a lot of my life, then when I became an economic hitman, again, I was living living in two worlds, this divided world. I came from, I was offering countries billions of dollars in debt to take on these huge loans, so-called develop their country. But in fact, what they were developing was the sectors that the rich people benefited from. And in a way, it was making the poor people poorer. And we can get into that in more detail. But it was this divided world. And we really feel that now. There's no question about it. Where we've got something like 25 individuals who have as much wealth as 3/4 of the Earth's population.
It's incomprehensible. So the funny thing, so you actually, you might have a client of mine. So you started out actually in the Peace Corps.
An ironic story. So I graduated from business school and I joined the Peace Corps, and primarily because I didn't want to get killed in Vietnam or kill people in Vietnam. I had, I kind of reflected the idea that Muhammad Ali expressed so eloquently when he said, I ain't got nothing against those Vietnamese. They never called me the N-word. They never tried to kill me. Why should I go over there and try to kill them or be killed by them? And I kind of, I didn't want to do that, but I did want to serve my country. I felt like a very loyal American, and so the Peace Corps was an alternative. So I graduated from business school. The Peace Corps sends me to 8 weeks of training in Southern California to learn Spanish, which if anybody out there who speaks another language knows, 8 weeks in a classroom doesn't give you a lot, it gives you something. And they also trained me to how to form credit and savings co-ops. And then they sent me deep into the Amazon rainforest to be with the Shuar people. Now, the Shuar people, first of all, when I got there and tried to speak my lousy Spanish with them, I discovered that my Spanish was a lot better than theirs because they spoke Shuar. and then I'm offering to help them form a credit and savings co-op. And I immediately get told, there's one guy who speaks Spanish, that's the school teacher. This is all translated, and my Spanish is really pretty poor, but I'm catching on. This guy says, well, there's no way you can form a credit and savings co-op here because we don't have any currency. This is a whole barter system. It's my your bananas. So I got to say that my first impression with U.S. government work was not the best. Teach you a language, send you to someplace where nobody speaks the language, teach you a skill to share with the people, and send you to people who can't possibly benefit from this skill. So here I am deep in the Amazon rainforest for the next 2 years with nothing to do, basically. And
you were actually promoting banking back then in an area where people were bartering. And so you wrapped up that your thing with the Peace Corps, and then what did you do after? You went to work with Stone and Webster or Charles T. Main? I can't remember how that worked.
Yeah, so I had been, in addition to joining the Peace Corps, before I actually joined the Peace Corps, I was recruited by the National Security Agency.
The NSA, yeah.
NSA, and the way that happened was that I just got married as in my last year in college, and my wife's father was very high up in the Department of the Navy in Washington, and one of his best friends was very high up in the NSA. That was another draft deferrable job, and again, being a loyal American. And so I'd gone through 2 days of very extensive tests, and a lot of them on a lie detector down on the JFK building in Boston, and was accepted into the National Security Agency. But then I heard a Peace Corps recruiter speak at the school, at Boston University, where I was in business school. And it really interested me, the whole idea of the Peace Corps. So I called this guy at the NSA, the friend of my father-in-law, and he encouraged it. He said, hey, we'll actually help you. And you can go into a place like the Amazon and you'll learn another language and you'll learn survival techniques and you'll learn about other cultures. And then when you come out, you can go to work for us. And he said, but it may so happen that you won't work directly for us. You may work for an American corporation. There's a lot of that. The National Security Agency, the CIA, all of our intelligence, we draw a lot from what we call assets that are people who are not card-carrying employees of ours, but have an affiliation with us. So when I got out of the Peace Corps, I was then recruited by Charles T. Main, this consulting firm in Boston, which at the time was very, very deeply.
They were huge. Are they still around? They were huge. I don't know. They've been bought out.
Well, they weren't so huge by some standards. We had 2,000 professional consultants and then a bunch of secretaries and other support system people. but eventually in the early mid 80s, they were bought out by another big firm in California. So they no longer exist as a company. They were bought out by another company. But so they recruit me to come in and become an economist at that company. It was a company at the time that was very, very low profile. We weren't allowed to talk to the press. We had a lot of influence all around the world, and with the World Bank and with many other governments, including our own. But it was very quiet. We were kept very quiet. And yeah, so I became an economist, and very quickly, through a number of series of events, I rose to chief economist and spent the next 10 years working for them and doing what I would call the work of an economic hitman.
Which you would go in and like you would go in to like a country and convince them to build up their infrastructure, whether it be the power grid or a dam, or what would be an example of a project you would do, John?
Well, let me start by saying, Barry, that one of the main themes of the book, Touching the Jaguar, is that our perceptions mold our reality.
Yeah.
And I was using that as an economist. That's what we do basically. So we were my job was to identify countries with resources our corporations covet, like oil.
Yeah.
And then to go to that country and produce a very, very fancy report with lots of econometric studies that would show that if that country took out a loan from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations for, let's say, in today's terms, several $1 billion, and then the country would not get the money, but they would reinvest it immediately. It would go directly to a U.S. corporation, like a Bechtel or a Halliburton or a General Electric or some company in the United States that would build big infrastructure projects in the country that we identified. Things like power plants and industrial parks, highways, ports, things that we could show. We created we would show, in fact, that when you invest in these things, the GDP grows, which it does, usually.
Yeah.
And the perception we were creating is that this is creating prosperity for everyone in the country. The president could use this to sell these, to put his country deep into debt.
Yeah.
As collateral, that would be the oil or whatever the resource was that was usually still in the ground. That would be the collateral. The country would take on this huge debt. These big infrastructure systems would be built. Our own corporations would make big profits off that. And the wealthy people in the country, the ones who own the industries, who own the commercial establishments and the banks, they would benefit a lot because they use a lot of electricity and highways and ports and so forth. But the majority of the people actually suffered because money was diverted from healthcare and education and other social services to pay the interest on the debt, to service the debt. And in the end, the country could never pay off the principal. And so we'd go back in, usually under the guise of the IMF, which is kind of the police force in this whole business, and restructure the debt. We'd say, hey, we'll restructure this loan to you. We'll give you a break on it, but you need to sell your utility systems, your public sector businesses to our investors at cut rate prices, or you need to sell your resource, your oil or whatever, very cheap to us with no environmental or social regulations. Let us build a military base on your soil. Basically, we were expanding this corporate empire, this global empire that was part of that was what was happening. But the perception always was that everybody's
get a benefit, yeah.
The truth, and I believed that for a long time. I was taught in business school, but over time, probably because I'd been in the Peace Corps, I'd seen how the poor people were being affected, and I spoke Spanish at that time very fluently. Saw that this was a perception we were creating, and through that perception, we created this reality of the belief system that was just causing huge income inequality amongst people around the world, and also expanding what we might call the American corporate empire.
You know, Jim, and this is, I hate to say it, but almost this is really what you were talking about, you know, when did the economic hitman come out? Around 2004, 2006, right around then, John?
2000, end of 2004.
Yeah. So roughly, 15, 16 years ago, you really is kind of a precursor to what's going on now within the United States. So what you were talking about, which is going on in, say, Latin America, is kind of going on within the United States today, or Europe. If you, I may be wrong, but that's what it appears to me.
Exactly.
So,
one of the reasons I wrote the most recent book, including Touching the Jaguar, is because I saw that what we had built, which was really a new model of exploitation, which didn't require the military, as empires are usually built through military intervention. The model we were building didn't require that. And incidentally, today the Chinese are taking the model that we to new levels of exploitation. But so the model that we were building then has come back now to really haunt us in the United States. So this huge amount of debt, that's credit card debt, education debt, healthcare debt. And now, of course, with the coronavirus, we're finding that we're having to go deep into debt to try to pull ourselves out of this. And, it's really, I think, showing up how we've misallocated resources over the last number of decades. Perhaps you could even go back to, say, ever since World War II. We've been putting a lot of resources to areas that aren't helping us now with the coronavirus at all. We're having to go deep into debt as a country, and it's very disturbing of where we're going, and yet it's it's the only way that we're going to survive.
yeah, would you agree on Eisenhower? But remember when his farewell speech about he warned about the military-industrial complex. Dwight, is conservative as they come. He said that was going to be the problem. That to me seems to be what has happened today. I mean, it's the military-industrial complex is just consuming so much of our own budget. I mean, we can't deliver decent healthcare in this country or low pharmaceutical costs, but we can bomb a country like Yemen into submission or whatever. I mean, has the military really been the expansion? This is what something Eisenhower warned about. What do you think?
Well, yes, totally. I think it's the idea that we're the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We've got less than 5% of the population. We've got about 25% of the coronavirus victims. What does that tell you? And on top of a lot of the other statistic is that we spend more money on our military than the next 10 countries combined, which includes, of course, Russia and China. But we are spending our money to a very large degree on archaic systems. The Chinese and the Russians are spending their money on cybernetics and perhaps biological protection of biological warfare, whatever. We're spending it on aircraft carriers. And, in this day of drones, you've got to ask yourself, do we need any more aircraft carriers? And the same with a lot of the other equipment that we're spending our money on. But of course, the system totally designed to keep that going, so that as I understand it, I've read that every state in the union benefits from the military budget. So New Hampshire, every state has some industry that gets money that benefits off the aircraft carriers and the archaic equipment. So every congressperson has to stand for a bigger military budget. It's very hard to oppose that and get reelected from any state in the United States today. So we're stuck in this system that's archaic, that's not really defending us from what we really need to be defended from. I mean, any rational human being today knows that the real danger from China or Russia or anyone else is an economic one, or a biological one, or a cybernetics one. The idea that Russia is actually going to start driving tanks or taking ships with tanks across the Atlantic, or that China is going to do it across the Pacific or whatever, it just doesn't make any sense. But they are out to replace us as the world leader, and they're doing it in very smart ways. We're not being very smart about it, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah. Now, another thing too, I call, this is luckily you grew up in New Hampshire, I grew up in Mass, but I love where I live now. and I'm very grateful for that. But the economics for the average American now, we're almost looking like a third world country, John. You know, if you look at like the savings rate, which is the true savings rate, and that's gone up because of the coronavirus. But if you look during the last financial crisis, it was actually negative. But you know, people, the Poles, the English, the Italians, everybody saved more than us. But we've kind of ruined this country economically for the regular people. Does that make sense to you? Or
Oh, yeah. I mean, and we look at the incredible debt that our states are incurring, our cities are incurring, and our country is incurring to fight this virus. Which again, I think it's necessary. You know, these measures have to be taken, but who's going to pay off the debt? It certainly isn't going to come through trickle-down economics. I think we've proven. To me, you know, I recently wrote a blog. You can get on my website, johnperkins.org, if you're interested in reading it, about how the coronavirus has basically, once and for all, ended the idea that Reagan economics, trickle economics works for the people, for the country. And so, you know, if we look historically at when we come out of other crises, the Great Depression, World War II, World War I, and so forth, we've had to tax wealthy people. And you know, taxing the poor and bumping the taxes on the rich simply is not an option, I think, at this point, if we want to survive as a country and any kind of situation that has any kind of influence on the world at all, or any kind of sanity. We need to really look at how we move into a new view of what it means to be successful economically. And it's a new perception. It's moving from what I call a death economy. A lot of economists are now referring to a death economy, an economic system that's consuming itself into extinction and is heavily dependent on huge amounts of debt. We need to move out of that system into one that we could call a life economy, that pays people, that pays investors to invest in systems that clean up pollution, that regenerate destroyed environments, that recycle, that create new technologies for our energy that'll make today's wind and solar look archaic in a few years. New technologies that are regenerative and that really create an economic system and a social system that works in the long run, that's not dependent on what the current system is dependent upon, which is a goal of maximizing short-term profits regardless of the social and environmental costs.
yeah, and you know, because I don't know, I think I was just looking at the stock market today, John, and I know the overall, what is it, like 30, 40 million people out of work, and the stock market keeps going up. It just this doesn't make any sense to me, because people are really hurting, and it was 40% of the population can't even come up with $400 for emergency. Let me ask you a question. So, you know, you kind of could have gone nice and quietly into the sunset. You've done well. So what motivated you to write Touching the Jaguar? Was it for the next generation? Was it for your grandson? Was it for your family? Why did you do it, John?
Well, that's a big question, Gary. You just answered part of it. And I have a 12-year-old grandson who lives not far from me, and I have a 30-some-odd-year-old daughter. And yeah, for them and their brothers and sisters around the world, but also I still spend a lot. I go back to the Amazon every year, except this year.
Yeah.
I was supposed to go I was supposed to be there right now. I have a lot of good friends who live marginal lives in this country and in many countries in Latin America. A lot of indigenous people. And I've written 5 books. Before I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I wrote 5 books on shamanism, shape-shifting, The World is As You Dream It, psychonavigation. And then I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, as you said, in late 2004. And since then, 3 other books on global economics, Hoodwinked, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And so the other reason so let me step back and say, I would speak at international economic forums. Like I spoke at one with 12,000 people in St. Petersburg, Russia, not long ago. You know, and there was the head of the Chase Manhattan Bank was there, and heads of state. Putin was there. Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, was there. A lot of, you know, it was amazing. And I would, in receptions, I would get into conversations with some of these people, and they'd say things like, "Hey, are you the same guy that wrote those woo-woo books on shamanism?" And then I also speak at events where we might call New Age or Germanic, whatever you want to call it, events. And people, they would say, "Are you that awful guy who was an economic hitman?" And to me, there was always a strong connection between these two worlds because they're both based on the idea that perception molds reality. So that's what shamanism is about. It's also what psychotherapy is about. It's quantum physics. It's corporations. You know, it's my job as an economic hitman was to create a perception that these large loans would raise the tide that would raise all the ships of all the people of these countries, which was a false perception. And corporations are based on the perception. You got to buy our product. You know, it's marketing, public relations. So I always saw this connection between these two, but it wasn't overt. And so Touching the Jaguar addresses both of these, and it talks about the connection between the two and how perception has got us into this terrible problem situation, the crises around the world today, whether it's climate change or income inequality, species extinction, environmental destruction, racism, COVID-19, those are all problems, but they're not the problem. They're symptoms of a much greater problem, which is this death economy, which is based on the perception that we have to maximize short-term profits and short-term consumption.
Who was it? Was it Friedman? Was it Milton Friedman who came up with that idea? I mean, that's just so much BS. You know, I'm just really, it's just shareholder value at all costs. And I mean, it's like throw everyone else under the bus.
Yeah, and Friedman wasn't, I mean, it had been building. Von Heineken won the Nobel Prize a couple of years before Friedman, and he said something similar, but Friedman won the Nobel Prize of economics in 76. He was extremely powerful. It was a presence, you know, Reagan totally embraced him, and Thatcher did, and all around the world, governments. He was paid to go to Chile and many other countries to help them formulate, and that was a driving force. And so he's the guy, although it had been building, he really the nail in that coffin. You know, he came out and said the only responsibility of business is to maximize short-term profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. Yeah. I'm paraphrasing, but basically that's what he said. Yeah, it's a terrible policy.
I think it's an emotionally bankrupt one. You know, I mean, we're only on this life for a little short period, okay? And my father taught me, who was Marine, and you know, he was a Marine in the Guadalcanal, and saw as much brutality as anyone. And he always warned me about the horrors of war and all this stuff. He was a really great man, but he said, son, you always leave a place better than the way you found it. And Friedman seems to be almost like just take as much as you possibly can and screw everyone else. So I don't know. It's just to me.
Yeah, and you know, it's a morally and an emotionally bankrupt policy, but it's also now we're finding out it's an economically bankrupt policy. It just doesn't work. Ultimately, it's very greedy. It's very short term. It gives CEOs the mandate to do whatever it takes to maximize short-term profits, and that includes destroying the resources upon which their long-term survival depends, because they're only in it for the short term. It includes destroying the environment. It includes exploiting people and the environment. It includes corrupting government officials and actually getting laws passed so that corruption is no longer legally corruption. You know, financing campaigns. So it runs totally contrary, Barry, to what it means to be human. I think if you look at our 250,000 years or so that we've seen ourselves as human beings, throughout most of that time, we've lived in life economies. And I experienced that when I lived with these people in the Amazon as a Peace Corps volunteer. They had a life economy. Their goal, as the goal of humans throughout most of history, has been to leave our children and our grandchildren a better environment than we inherited, or at least as good a one. And it's only been within the last blink of an eye, historically speaking, we've focused on this greed, this idea that we have to accumulate more and more and more, and in order for me to have a bigger piece of the pie, you've got to have a smaller piece of the pie. That's a pretty recent concept.
Yeah, and the thing is, John, too, is that one of the things we gets back to banking. I researched this back in Mesopotamia, like 4,000 years ago, that the maximum they could charge on a loan for interest on debt was I think it was like maybe 10% in silver, maybe or 30% in barley. That was the maximum you could charge. But what's the maximum you can charge on a loan today in America?
Is there a maximum?
There is no maximum.
Right.
I mean, if you say religions, Judaism, Christianity, even Islam, whatever they say, you shouldn't be charging excessive interest. So there is no maximum interest on loans right now, and so it's so much in the debt. Now, let me ask you one of the things I got out of the book. Okay, reading the book. It's a great book, by the way. I highly recommend it, and it's a good read. You're a good writer. I don't know. It flows really nicely. Touching the Jaguar, to me, it was like overcoming my fear, having the guts to speak the truth. But it hasn't been really easy. Hi, I'm John Perkins, I'm the economic hitman. You were pretty scared putting the first book out. Am I correct? I mean, how many people turned you down? And I think this is really important for people to understand that this was not easy for you for you to do.
Well, right, yeah, and you're right. Touching the Jaguar, the shaman that first expressed that to me said, that means identifying your fear, your blockages, what holds you back from doing what you want to do. Identify them, and then confront them. Don't run from your fear, the blockages. Admit to them. Touch them. When you touch them, it helps you change your perception to give you whatever you need to move on to do what you want to do. And the Confessions of an Economic Hitman was rejected by 39 publishers. That's a lot of Jaguars to touch. After about the 7th rejection, I just sort of wanted to throw it all in. But I had an earlier experience.
39, John?
39 rejection letters. So where I went to prep school, I was a good writer. I got the short story prize. I was editor of the newspaper. And then I went to Middlebury College. And
I almost went there. Yeah, I didn't know. Okay.
Yeah,
You went?
I went there on a full scholarship. And I had an English teacher who I had great respect for. He was a published writer. I was really looking forward to having him as an English teacher. He hated my writing. He wouldn't give me anything above a C. And it devastated me. Because writing was so important to me. I always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an Englishman, a writer. It devastated me. I quit college. I quit Middlebury. I left. And I later went back, but I went back and I went to business school at Boston University. And I didn't have to do much writing there. I didn't want to write anything creative. I was scared. I was so injured by that. But years later, when I decided, I really want to write about some of this stuff, I had to touch that Jaguar. And then I came to realize, and I actually did a little research, and I saw that this English professor that didn't like my writing also hated Bob Dylan's writing. Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature, So there's a big Jaguar that I touched there. I say, hey, this English teacher is just a human being. Why am I letting him destroy my life? Why am I letting him have such an impact on me? Touch that Jaguar. You can write. Get out there and write. Years later, when I got these rejection slips, 39 publishers, and even though I'd already published 5 other books, so I thought it was, I knew the business. Every time I got one of those rejection slips, I'd say to myself, well, that editor probably just had a fight with her husband at breakfast, and she's in a bad mood. She's putting everything in the rejection slip. Or maybe this editor had a headache when they came to work today, or this one doesn't like my politics, or whatever. So I would create these stories. I didn't know what the truth was, but the perception I would create was, it isn't about me. It isn't about my writing. It's about the editor. And as it turns out, after a small publisher finally published the book, and it went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list very, very quickly, stayed there for a year and a half. It sold more than 2 million copies now in 37 languages.
37? I thought 36. So 37, huh?
It's 37 now. And, you know, after that, the small publisher ended up being, you know, all the big publishers, after it became a hit in the hardback, they all wanted to buy the paperback rights, all the ones that rejected it before. And eventually Penguin and Random House had this huge bidding war. Penguin eventually bought it for a lot of money. We're talking 6 zeros here. And they could have gotten it for free, you know, a year earlier. And as I talked to some of these people, I realized that exactly the perception that I was interpreting was true. They were afraid of it politically. They just didn't want to do the vetting on it. They had an argument with their husband or their spouse at breakfast. And so, you know, I think the idea that perception, what do we do with perception? Right now, people stuck at home. I talk to a lot of people these days. I do webinars, and people say, hey, I don't think I can handle another day self-quarantining. Forget about another month or 2 months, or how long is it going to be? And that's a perception. I'll say, well, wait, didn't you tell me a while back that you wanted to learn to play the flute? You got a flute. The internet can teach you how to play the flute. Didn't you tell me you always wanted to write a book? Well, here's your opportunity.
Here's your chance.
Yeah. Didn't you tell me you wanted to read more books? Didn't you tell me you wanted to really understand what's going on in the world and read more about that, that you wanted to talk to your relatives who live in another country? So once we change that perception, we touch that jagger, what is it that's holding me back? It's a very, very powerful experience.
But also, I think too, John, this is because believe me, when I wrote my first books, and I've sold my books in 23 countries now, not 36, but not in 20. I've sold my books in 23 countries, but everyone said I couldn't do it. You know, everyone said I couldn't do it, and I think a lot of it is just having the faith. To me, I'm a Christian, so it's a very important part of my life. But it was really facing my fears and just doing it anyway. I mean, it's really the discipline, and I think maybe touching the jaguar, I think it's really kind of facing your fears and doing it anywhere. I mean, because if we don't face our fears, we don't have resistance, we're not going to accomplish anything in life. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, that's a great analogy, a great story. And I think that at this point in time, we need to understand we're being told that we got to get back to normal. We get a vaccine or whatever happens, we need to get back to normal. I think we need to touch that jaguar and say, wait a minute, it's normal that's caused these problems. Normal that's put us here. It's normal that's had us invest all this money in aircraft carriers instead of looking at how we protect ourselves from viruses, or looking at cybersecurity. We don't want to go back to the old normal. We need to create a new normal. And that really is moving from an economic system that's a failure, this death economy that's failing us, to a life economy. And this doesn't mean we got to go live in grass houses or caves or something. This means simply that we've got to change how we look at economic activity. And there's a lot of that's already been happening because of the virus. It's been happening, you know. A lot of industries that are not going to survive this, but the ones that do survive are going to be very oriented toward a new reality, the reality that we're participating in right now, Barry, as we're talking through this Zoom medium, you know, and this kind of thing. There's so many new businesses, new opportunities that will come out of this that are part of what we could call a life economy. So let's touch the jaguar that says, hey, we've got to go back to normal, and say, no, normal put us here. We want to create a new normal, and it's going to be a fun and exciting time. We can all participate in it, but we've got to figure out ways to participate in a new manner, and one that creates greater income equality, greater social equality, less racism, no racism, and that where we invest our money in things that really protect us and our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren as we move into the future.
John, this has been great. We'll have to do this again sometime. You know, and I highly recommend your book, Touching the Jaguar. And people can find more about you by going to johnperkins.org. Am I correct?
Correct, yes.
And then the Touching the Jaguar book, that has its own separate website. Am I correct?
It was at touchingthejaguarbook.com. Yes. And Barry, I just want to say that I'm glad that you do still have a little bit of that New Hampshire accent. So it's a jaguar.
The Jaguar. Get some chowder, Bobby.
You got that New Hampshire accent.
New Hampshire, you betcha. You know, so
I like that. And just remember, you know, I'm always touching the. Look at her ears. She's like, wait a minute, he's talking about me again. What's this? She sits on my lap and she says, I love this conversation of jaguars.
yeah. So no. So keep pushing back the frontiers of ignorance, John. You know, and let's keep in touch. And this has been so great. I've been so grateful to reconnect with you. Let's do this again sometime.
I'd love to do that, Barry, and keep up your great work. What you're doing is so important, and I very much appreciate what you do. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless.
He counted on America to be passive. He counted wrong.